There's a concept recognized as rationalization. This is when you tell yourself an answer as opposed to using logic. A classic example is hearing something in a different room when you're alone. Rationally, you tell yourself it's nothing. Logically, you should get up to check anyway. Nate Fisher Jr. in 6 Feet Under is the kind of man that brushes off a gut feeling and sees that as optimism. Nate is deeply insecure and represses his true emotions, fearing they'll make him weak. Instead of confronting them, he lashes out, avoids responsibility, and seeks validation through impulsive decisions. He doesn't see himself that way. Nate sees himself as honest, free, morally centered, spontaneous, open-hearted, and good. And we do see shades of that at the beginning. Nate confronts his brother about emotional honesty and moral superiority, believing that at least showing how he feels is better than repressing it in fear of looking like a bad person. His expectation of David not only comes from the disgust of his family's inherent repression, but also from the subconscious knowledge that his definition is just a hair above entirely repressed and dead. He thinks his shallow definition of sincerity is enough. He thinks he has a claim to authenticity by believing he's not like the rest, but there's not much outside of dysfunction he's truly known. Let's take a look at Nate from Season 1. Season 1, Nate says, "You're not better than anyone." He is self-righteous, idealistic, and confrontational. Nate confronts David over their father's death. It's a harsh, almost explosive outburst that comes from Nate's belief that David is cold, overly formal, and emotionally repressed. The audience really respects the character Nate puts on, and comes to expect the actions that come with that character. Nate fails to deliver that through the series because he isn't coming from a place of good intent. He's coming from a place of perceived superiority. Nate believes in that moment that emotional openness is superior to repression. He believes that David's rigidity is a form of moral failure, and Nate is there to break the cycle. He believes he is the person who can shake up the family's dysfunction simply by being more real. Again, Nate thinks he's being emotionally honest, but he's operating from a place of superiority. He's reacting to his own discomfort with grief, not by confronting it, but by shifting blame onto his brother, his younger brother, who really had no skin in the game at that point. It's his first big moment of deflection, dressed as moral clarity. So let's compare that real quick to how we see him at the end of Season 5. Season 5, Nate says, "You can't take a picture of this, it's already gone." Nate is dazed, haunted, and existential. He speaks to Claire after the second AVM, after he dies. Claire is trying to take a picture of the moment, of her family, perhaps to preserve it, and Nate tells her it's already gone. What Nate understands in that moment is that moments cannot be preserved just like people, feelings, or identities. That everything he built, his self-image, his relationships, his family, is transient and maybe always was. But that wasn't something he was ignorant of. He just took it for granted. He knows that he's already disappeared from his life in many ways, long before his physical death. So it's not wisdom he's giving her. It's the echo of regret. Wisdom leaves you with confidence, not fear or uncertainty. What Nate thinks is a reminder is a false reality driven by learned hopelessness. Nate isn't saying it's already gone as some Zen acceptance of impermanence. He's saying it as someone who realized he missed the chance to be present for any of it. He couldn't be fully captured or known by anyone because he never let himself be fully seen. Nate is terrified of death and resents its randomness, just like he resents his own lack of control over life. He avoids vulnerability and ultimately dies in a way that reflects this. Sudden, unresolved, mid-struggle. This deep internal conflict doesn't stem from just nowhere. Nate was someone who desperately needed direction in life and never got it. Trying to step into the role of freedom led him to being SA'd as a teenager by his aunt's friend. His mother is the only one who thinks what happened to him was wrong, but it's a mix of his emotionally incestual relationship with his mother, her smothering neurotic attitude, but cold detachment that put him in danger in the first place. His abuse being allowed wasn't a lapse of care. He was set up for it unconsciously, essentially being trafficked and given as a gift to his aunt's friend. One of the absolutely biggest tragedies about his aunt is that although she showed herself to be there for her sister and improved herself in the long run by beating her addictions, she never apologized to Nate. Sober or not, she sees what she did as an act of liberation, but what she really did was pass trauma down to Nate. Because he was never allowed to see what happened to him as wrong without feeling neurotic, his entire sense of right and wrong was permanently affected. The emotional incest dynamic between Ruth and Nate Jr. is subtle but powerful, and it helps explain why he feels both repelled by and drawn to maternal women like Lisa, but also compelled yet repelled to women like Brenda, who are true cycle breakers, whose nurturing identity comes after winning it back. His trauma of SA and EI is why his sense of self is so fractured. If you can't separate from your mother emotionally, every woman you love becomes a mirror and a bear trap. Ruth is emotionally starved, and she turns to her children, especially Nate Jr., to fulfill the companionship and emotional regulation her adult relationships never provided. Nate is the child she idealizes, projects onto, and leans on for meaning. He becomes a surrogate partner without being consciously aware of it. This leads to inappropriate emotional intimacy. Not physical, but psychic over-involvement. The lack of clear maternal boundaries teaches Nate two things: that he must be who others need him to be, and that real love is suffocating. This isn't helped by the fact that Ruth inhabits the uniquely parental narcissistic trait of believing nobody is good enough for your child except a partner that's just like the EI parent. In his little fever dream, Nate sees Lisa and his mother as one person. This moment is grotesque, Freudian, and deeply sad. It's the collapse of his adult and child selves, his guilt and desire, his need for care, and his fear of submission. Lisa becomes the mother figure who was never whole because, like Ruth, she wanted Nate to complete her. She weaponized vulnerability to control him, and he resented her, not just as a partner, but as a symbolic return to his own emotional imprisonment. This is his psychic contention with himself, his own disgust at himself, and how what he thought was the good and right thing was still centered around a lie he only knew as truth. Nate never got to fully individuate from Ruth. He always carried her grief, her intensity, her unspoken fears, which filled in the blanks his father left. So with women, he subconsciously creates the same loop. Craves nurturing, he then resents dependence, he then retreats through detachment, affairs, or moral superiority. This unspoken bond with Ruth deprives him of authentic autonomy and keeps him emotionally stunted even in adulthood. He doesn't understand that saying the hard part out loud isn't enough to break the cycle, but it is enough to keep it alive within you if you can't handle it. Ruth teaches him the lack of boundaries. All of Ruth's partners, Hiram, Nikolai, George, all mere aspects of life. They're volatile, controlling, and withholding. The problem with EI mothers is that their own trauma made them attractive to emotionally unavailable men. When they try to make their son their boyfriend, the son is brainwashed into fulfilling that role to varying degrees But there's always a level of rebellion underneath the submission because 9 times out of 10, the son knows it isn't right. So they also become emotionally unavailable, associating the true romantic partner-like behavior coming from their mom as disgusting, as they should. This disgust, however, gets transferred to their real-life romantic partners, who, to them, are acting like their mom. The inability to differentiate love from enmeshment echoes across the family, and Nate pays the deepest price. Ruth's attempt at enmeshing doesn't work the same with her gay son, although it does have effects on him. It also doesn't work the same on her daughter Claire, who rejects that level of hysteria. She sees it as not just abnormal, but unacceptable. Nate's sexual trauma manifests in his relationship with Lisa by passively going along with her expectations and making up for the guilt and pressure he puts on himself to make up for what didn't work out. He doesn't love Lisa, but he stays with her anyway, possibly because her control over him mirrors the lack of agency he had in his abuse. Through Lisa, he tried to seek a meaning in his abuse that worked out for him, not the truth. He alternates between resentment and compliance, repressing his past while still acting out the effects of it. While others in his life challenge him, Lisa dictates him, using the little vulnerability he allows himself as means of control. To him, this kind of one-on-one is something he understands through trauma. He doesn't actually have to be open-minded, he just gets to act out what he thinks someone should do. When she dies, that vulnerability dies with her, leaving behind a version of Nate that's unable to commit to anything. Relationships, self-reflection, or even a real identity. Nate enters his marriage with Lisa in a state of repression. He's just undergone AVM surgery, cheated on Brenda, and became a father unexpectedly. He convinces himself that marrying Lisa and living a simple life will bring him peace. But the reality is that his repression and resentment made him a ticking time bomb, and if Hoyt hadn't killed Lisa, Nate might have when he found out about her affair while she was alive. While those are circumstances that are horrible for any man to weather, Nate was looking for a good reason to crash out. Lisa picks up on his insecurities and reinforces them, subtly implying that any deviation from the domestic life she envisions means he's failing as a husband and a father. She presents her control as concern. Nate operates from moral superiority, so when Lisa manipulates him, she's speaking his first language. He talks the talk, but she's practiced what the walk looks like. Even though she forgives and hides her own moral shortcomings, like engaging with married men after telling them their souls connect like no other, she tells Nate what to eat, how to feel, how to act, always under the guise of what's best for him. She thinks she's got everything down on lock, and even in death, Nate sees her as some kind of protective god. She uses the fact that others question themselves around her to get what she wants from them, like a devil does. Unlike Brenda, who confronts Nate's avoidance head-on, Lisa micromanages his emotions by making him feel guilty for not conforming. This dynamic keeps Nate locked in a passive role. Instead of questioning his own unhappiness, he tries to mold himself into the person Lisa wants him to be. When Lisa disappears, Nate initially spirals into grief, but as time passes, something else happens. The part of him that was willing to try to be open, however flawed that attempt was, dies with her. Lisa's death doesn't free him, it leaves him hollow. He no longer knows who he is or what he wants. He doesn't even know that he doesn't want to feel controlled until he projects his overdeveloped traumas onto Brenda's healing. He jumps into a relationship with Brenda, still seeking to be taken care of, but more pathetic than ever. He's different now, colder, more detached. He no longer has the illusion of being a good man, and instead of making peace with his past, he leans further into avoidance. Post-Lisa, Nate refuses to fully engage in anything real. He proposes to Brenda, but immediately second-guesses it. He continues seeking affairs and momentary escapes. Even when Maya is right in front of him, he struggles to be her father in a meaningful way, using every excuse to pawn her off on his family while he licks his wounds. Maya has been suffering from an emotionally wrecked household, now a dead mother, and an absent father that eventually dies too. She inherits the most blanks to be filled. Lisa's suffocating control was the last thing that tethered Nate to an idea of emotional responsibility, even if it was a flawed one. Once it was gone, he was left with nothing but guilt and impulse. Lisa represented a false version of stability, one built on control rather than real emotional connection. And when that false stability was ripped away, Nate doesn't build something better in its place. He simply floats through life, sabotaging every real opportunity for happiness. His AVM returning is the physical manifestation of this. Proof that no matter how much he runs from himself, his unresolved wounds will always catch up with him. With Brenda, Nate swings between intense intimacy and emotional withdrawal. His need for control plays out in how he judges her past but refuses to acknowledge his own. When she is vulnerable, he responds with distance or cruelty because her openness forces him to face his own buried pain. Nate projects his pain onto others. He's very cruel towards his brother David, often belittling David's struggles, calling him uptight or repressed when, in reality, Nate is projecting his own shame. He dismisses David's fears about being openly gay, but is blind to how his own internalized trauma dictates his actions. He has a very judgmental nature. Nate often positions himself again as morally superior, but his judgments of others, like Brenda's past, David's struggles, and even Rico's own affair, all stem from a deep self-loathing he refuses to confront. Everyone suffers from this to some extent. The only reason people approve of or resent others for being strong enough to act beyond that narrative is because they were told those people had a real reason to hate themselves. While their personal form of degrading and neglectful self-talk is considered normal. There's a harmful myth that victims of SA are more likely to become abusers, but research shows this is not statistically true. 6 Feet Under challenges this by showing different ways survivors process trauma. Nate represses it and self-destructs. Brenda intellectualizes it and struggles with intimacy. Billy, without proper support, swings between breakdowns. None of them perpetuate harm in the way the myth suggests. If anything, they harm themselves far more than anyone else. The issue is that untreated trauma, when ignored or denied, leads to self-sabotage, unhealthy relationships, and emotional isolation. These are different moments he chose to continue sabotaging himself. Nate lashes out at David during the family dinner in almost the exact same way he lashes out at him after their father's death. He attacks him for not supporting his AVM surgery plan. And he says, "You don't get to tell me what to do with my body just because you play the part of the responsible one." But what's really happening there is that Nate is terrified of death and dying. But he can't admit that vulnerability. It's arguably harder for him to admit than most without the help of a therapist because he has clear trauma from his specific upbringing. So he redirects it towards David's coldness, painting David as controlling instead of recognizing his fear and his trauma around life itself. Learning it ends is traumatizing, and that truth was never soft on him. He deflects and turns his anxiety about mortality into a moral crusade against control. Nate also blames Brenda for Lisa's disappearance. Brenda visits after Lisa goes missing. Nate welcomes her, sleeps with her, and then throws her out. He tells her, "I don't know why I let you in here." Nate is spiraling with guilt and confusion. Reconnecting with Brenda brings up his past, and instead of facing it, he punishes her for giving him comfort. The fantasy of her mixes with the reality of his circumstance, and for once, escape isn't possible. Nothing happened except that he betrayed himself again. He projects his guilt over Lisa onto Brenda, using sex as a momentary escape and rejection as a weapon. Because Brenda is Nate's true reality, everything is real around her. Nothing about who she is and the space she inhabits can be avoided or locked away or fantasized about. He misunderstood the traits left from her trauma as something she could control the way he thinks he could, when she didn't want to have those hyper-compulsory traits. The fun and fantasy for her was quickly ruined once she lost Nate as a consequence. But because of her sheer vulnerability and the way he relates to her so deeply, she becomes the mirror he punches and the salt in his wound. All he sees her as is an object, where it's to take care of or throw away. So by season 4, his negativity isn't a surprise. Nate undermines Brenda after Maya's return. Brenda questions whether Maya should stay with her or Nate based on stability. He says, "You think I'm gonna traumatize her? You think you're the one who gets to say who's healthy?" Nate knows he's emotionally unavailable. He knows he has traumatized his daughter, but rather than sit with that, he twists the situation to make Brenda seem cruel and elitist. He projects that onto her from what he doesn't want to admit about Lisa. Brenda can be cocky, but allows herself to be humbled more often as she heals. He disguises his self-doubt as indignation, painting Brenda as judgmental rather than facing the fact that she's right. He knows she wants to be right and do the right thing. But because he's convinced no one can have all the right answers anyway, he dismisses everything she tries to do despite what she's been through. Then immediately begins pulling away. Nate's unresolved guilt over Lisa, fear of being trapped, and sexual dissatisfaction all get buried under the narrative of doing the right thing. Rather than admit he's unsure and turn to Brenda for strength and comfort, he clings to the image of being a good partner, then cheats and detaches emotionally. The cruelty involved in breaking up with Brenda in the hospital is hard to watch. He tells her, "I can't do this anymore." He wants happiness and peace without trying, preferring to destroy himself and die, over face his issues on his own. Nate feels like he's about to die and can't bear to face the truth of what he's built. He weaponizes his honesty to hurt her at the exact moment she is most vulnerable. He leaves her for an affair partner. Instead of dealing with the shame of his own inconsistency, instead of appreciating the love Brenda has given to him through her own struggles, while she believed this all meant something for them, he punishes Brenda for loving him too long. We can see the recurring patterns of Nate's repression. He uses silence as punishment. He has long, cold periods of withdrawal rather than communication specifically to the women and girls in his life. Again, he drops off his daughter with whoever. He uses sex as a distraction, affairs, and meaningless hookups not just for intimacy but avoidance. And he moralizes to avoid guilt. He often positions himself as the good guy so he doesn't have to face the hurt he causes. Nate couldn't sit in discomfort, so he made other people carry it for him. And when they couldn't or wouldn't, he called them cold, unloving, or broken. But really, he was talking about himself. As I touched on before, Nate's AVM can be seen as a metaphor for how internalized wounds, especially trauma that is never acknowledged, manifest in destructive ways. Instead of dealing with his past, Nate buries it, but his body remembers. His AVM, a literal ticking time bomb, reflects how long unresolved pain eventually surfaces, whether we acknowledge it or not. The fact that his AVM returns after he seemingly fixes his life, marrying Lisa, having a child, pretending to be content, suggests that suppressing trauma doesn't heal it, it only delays the inevitable. His AVM represents this repression. His wounds manifest physically because he refuses to deal with them emotionally, and his inability to be vulnerable in a healthy way leads to a short, conflicted life. Nate's AVM first emerges as a sudden life-threatening condition, but rather than treating it as a wake-up call, he spends much of the series oscillating between denial and reckless acceptance. This mirrors his broader approach to life. He either ignores problems entirely or indulges in self-destructive impulses, assuming things will somehow work out. But the AVM just isn't a random illness, it's the physical embodiment of his internal contradictions. He spends his life bottling up guilt, resentment, and fear, never truly engaging with them. Instead of confronting his insecurities, he seeks external validation through relationships, through impulsive decisions, through running from one version of himself to another. The AVM, like those repressed emotions, doesn't just go away. It lurks beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when it can no longer be ignored. Throughout 6 Feet Under, Nate grapples with grief in ways that are deeply unhealthy. After his father's death, he takes on the responsibility of the funeral home, even though it's never what he truly wanted. He buries his emotions under duty and expectation, pretending to be the responsible eldest son, while internally resenting the weight of it all. His guilt over Lisa, his self-loathing over failed relationships, his frustration with life never giving him what he thinks he deserves, it all builds up inside of him, unspoken and unresolved. Just like his AVM, these emotions don't simply dissipate, they fester. And when they finally come to the surface, whether in moments of cruelty, self-sabotage, or sheer emotional exhaustion, it's always in destructive ways. His outbursts, his hurtful words, his retreat into infidelity and recklessness, these are all symptoms of wounds he has never allowed himself to truly examine. When the AVM returns, it feels less like an external event and more like an inevitability. He ignored the warning signs, both physically and emotionally, for too long. Just as he never fully processed his grief or his personal failures, he never really confronted his own mortality in a meaningful way. Even when faced with a second chance at life after his initial surgery, he doesn't use it to grow. He continues to make the same mistakes, falling into old patterns of avoidance, resentment, and self-destruction. This just ends up having harsher consequences, ones he still thinks aren't fair. The final stroke that kills him isn't just a medical event, it's the culmination of everything he never dealt with. Unlike David, who processes his trauma, or Brenda, who works through her toxic upbringing, Nate never reaches that point of true self-awareness. His body literally gives out under the weight of what he's been carrying. The AVM is the embodiment of all the things Nate refused to acknowledge. His resentment towards his father and the expectations placed on him, his guilt over the way he treated others, particularly Brenda and David, his fear of commitment masked by impulsive decisions, and his deep insecurity which led him to blame others while also punishing himself. Unlike his brother David, who actively works through his trauma, or Brenda, who slowly learns to trust herself, Nate never fully faces his pain. He lashes out, he runs, he self-destructs, and ultimately, his AVM, like the weight of his unprocessed emotions, takes him down. If 6 Feet Under argues that vulnerability is essential for a meaningful life, then Nate serves as the proof. His tragedy isn't just that he dies young, it's that he never truly allows himself to live authentically. He mistakes defensiveness for strength, indulgence for freedom, and avoidance for survival. As proof in their own right, the characters who embrace vulnerability, who allow themselves to grieve, to change, to be honest with themselves, are the ones who ultimately find peace. David, despite his struggles, builds a life with Keith. Brenda, after years of dysfunction, finally starts making choices for herself. Ruth, even in her loneliness, gains a deeper understanding of what she wants. Nate, tragically, never reaches that point, and in the end, his AVM serves as a reminder that what we bury inside ourselves will always find a way to surface, whether we're ready for it or not. Nate never truly grows. He spends his life running from one thing to the next, trying to find external solutions to internal wounds. His death is tragic, not just because it happens young, but because it happens before he ever really lives in a way that's free from fear and denial. In life, Nate was fractured, trying to be good without being honest. In death, he's whole only because someone chose to remember the best of him. It doesn't mean he was redeemed, it means someone loved him anyway. The closest thing we have to the afterlife as the living is the witnessing of it in action and the ripples. We never think about the fact that we are born into waves of loss. At this point in human history, there are more dead people than ones alive. Witnessing the afterlife in action is what the show is about, not in a ghostly way, but in the psychic and psychological way. Heaven is to be remembered in love, to be seen as more than the worst that we did, and to become the best version of ourselves in someone else's memory. Nate Sr. was emotionally walled off, but unlike Nate Jr., he knew he was. He accepted those limits. There's an honesty in that coldness, but Nate Jr. never gets there. He wants to be both emotionally expansive and morally detached, and it tears him apart. And in the end, Nate becomes the father he never understood. Unreachable, quietly anguished, beloved but never quite present, and without the ability ever to be again. You spend your whole life trying not to become your father, and then you wonder why he still won't leave you alone. In life, Nate Sr. is distant, gruff, and often just out of reach. Claire and David describe him as stressed and stoic. Ruth refers to his coldness as both protective and punishing. Nate Jr. didn't rebel just to be free. He rebelled to escape becoming this man. He resents his father's detachment, but inherited it all the same. In refusing to run the funeral home, Nate thinks he's doing something different, but he still ends up performing emotional labor without ever really processing his own grief. Nate Sr. appears to Nate Jr. in surreal, darkly comic, and sometimes hostile visions. He teases him, judges him, occasionally offers wisdom, but over time the tone changes. The appearances become more reflective, intimate, and even tender. There's a recognition of mutual pain and shared failure. Nate Jr. never got this in life, but in death he finally admits, "I don't know who I am." And Nate Sr. answers, "That makes two of us." You don't just grieve the dead, you grieve the parts of them you never got to know. And when the man you call your father was never fully there, your grief becomes a search for answers, for closure, for anything that feels like love. We never really know Nate Sr., and that's the point. Across the series, Nate Sr. is more myth than a man. The family remembers him as dry, irritable, and sarcastic. Claire describes him as scary. David describes him as cold. Ruth describes him as her life's greatest disappointment and also her only real partner. And what we get are pieces, glimpses of tenderness, the way he touched the casket, joking with Claire, hints of disapproval, his ghost taunting David and warning Nate, and long stretches of silence. For Nate Jr., the incompleteness is the legacy. He never got to know his father in any whole sense. He left home, resisted the business, and refused to take on what he saw as his father's burden. But after death, the father appears anyway. Not to give closure, not to explain, but to echo, haunt, question, and occasionally gently guide. And that's what it's like to be raised by a half-present parent. You fill in the blanks. You project your needs onto the silence. You spend your adulthood trying not to be them, while accidentally repeating everything they couldn't name. All you have is their influence. All you see is their patterns, or the lack thereof. The dead don't explain themselves. We decide who they were. Nate Jr.'s conversations with Nate Sr. after death aren't about truth. They're about coping with the absence of it. He needs him to be kind. He needs him to be honest. He needs him to say something, but what he gets is fragmented, just like the memories he's always had. That's the heart of parental grief. You miss what was there, but also what never was. And for Nate Jr., the tragedy is doubled because his father's silence became the model for his own. Nate's story can be summed up as such. Unless you fill in the blanks yourself, those blanks are what you inherit. Some people pass down money, some people pass down stories, but the hardest inheritance is the silence, the things they didn't say, the things they didn't face, the parts of themselves they left undone. Those are the parts we carry, and unless we name them, they become ours. Nate's life was full of blanks he never tried to fill. His essay, unacknowledged. His father's distance, unexplored. His mother's needs, resented and misunderstood. His own needs, unmet, unnamed, and projected outward. And so he lived reactively, with no framework for reflection. Every moment of lashing out, withdrawal, infidelity, moralizing, it wasn't conscious cruelty. It was a defense against looking into the empty spaces inside of him. Nate inherited silence and passed it on. Nate Sr. was a silent man who never explained himself. Nate Jr. became a man of loud opinions but quiet truths. He talked about freedom, justice, and family, but never about fear, shame, and guilt. He couldn't fill in the blanks because he didn't even believe they needed to be filled. He believed he was already better, and that belief protected him from growth. And when you refuse to fill in the blanks, you live as a fragment. Nate's story ends not with clarity, but with a rupture. A marriage broken, daughter left in limbo, a family reeling. He's present in the final moments of the show, but only as a memory, as a symbol, as a ghost. Not because he's transcended, because he never fully arrived. Nate becomes what his father was to him, an echo, someone his loved ones must reinterpret in order to survive. Nate Fisher thought the worst thing that could happen to him was to be like his father, but he never understood that what made his father distant wasn't his stoicism, it was his refusal to be seen. And in the end, Nate became a man no one could fully see either, because unless you name the silence, unless you claim the silence, it claims you, and what you don't face becomes what you pass on.